except that that imposes some discipline on our part. So I'm going to ask our colleagues dealing with the diaspora, session to try and see if we can do it in like half an hour. Yeah, yeah. And then we'll move very quickly to the next session led by Winnie Rugut from University of Nairobi. So without further ado, I think let me introduce my colleague Blair. Okay. So Dr. Blair Proctor, you can also call him Professor Blair Proctor, as is the lingua is in the US. He's Assistant Professor of African History, Department of Black Studies, State University of New York, at New Paltz. He is, more importantly, Fulbright scholar at our center, the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Witwatersrand, and is also not only a colleague but a friend. I've known Assad for a couple of years. We've had not only lots of academic, intellectual work to do, but also we've had fun together. So I'm happy to introduce Blair, who is going to be moderator for this session. Over to you.
All right. Thank you, Brother Bob. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the end of this juncture and for this panel titled African Diaspora as an Avenue for African Agency. And as the moderator, but it'll be more of a discussion, just more of a conversation. And for centuries, countless attempts of diasporic Africans returning to continental Africa, regardless of region, whether individualistic or supported through the government for opportunities to expatriate, some successful and other occasions for tragic failures. This discussion will center on African agency within the context of the African diaspora's contributions to development efforts across the continent. By empowering cultural exchange and structured engagement strategies that recognize their potential as agents for change, we can create impactful synergies between Africans' diverse populations, both at home and abroad, ultimately leading toward sustainable growth for all involved. And pretty much what will be discussed through this conversation is African agency as a theoretical framework or concept, also research and knowledge production within the African diasporic perspective, African agency within the 21st century, social and economic challenges, and also diaspora activism and advocacy. So we'll start with what is the definition that we could say from an African diasporic perspective of African agency?
1, 2, all right, how are you guys doing? I'm Assad with the African Center for the Study of the United States, and I'm from New Orleans, and I just want to say my social media is a bit tapped out right now, so we're going to go through this pretty quickly. So, I wrote a definition. African agency is the ability for the continent to chart its own course and to operate in its own interest. In addition, when I thought of this definition, there was a couple of quotes that came to mind. When I think of agency, or when we think of agency, there should be an immediate thought of power. And so I thought of the Frederick Douglass quote, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will." But then there's another quote about power from Dr. Huey P. Newton, where he says that power is the ability to control phenomenon and make it act in a desired manner. If the continent does not have the power that it needs to define phenomena. And that's one aspect of it. White supremacy, colonialism, and racism define so many things for us. So when we talk about decolonization, de-Westernization, it's really a redefinition of some of these terminologies. But not only redefining, there must be the power to make it act in a desired manner. And so when I think of that type of power, I think of military might, I think of economic might, as well as the cultural capital that Africa has been producing.
All right, thanks, Brother Assad. And we also have another professor who is also online. Can you please introduce yourself?
I guess you're talking about me. It's Rico Chapman here.
Yes.
How's everybody doing? I'm Rico Chapman. I'm the Dean of the College of the Arts at Jackson State University. I'm also a professor of history here at Jackson State, and recently a Fulbright research scholar at Wits University in South Africa.
Okay, fellow Fulbrighter.
Yeah, right.
And also my late father was born in Jackson, Mississippi.
Oh, good. Glad to know that.
Yeah, so what is your definition of African agency from an African diasporic perspective?
From an African diasporic perspective, African agency to me simply means, in the spirit of Steve Biko, Black consciousness, in the spirit of Kwame Ture, Carmichael, Black Power, and in the spirit of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, Pan-Africanism. So African agency to me, as we speak about this diaspora, I think we first need to start with identity and breaking down those barriers of ethnic divisions. Though they're there, if we look at ourselves globally as one people, I think that's where the agency starts.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I think this conference speaks to that. And I'm really appreciative of those who organized this conference and the two scholars that are presenting today and the other panelists, because as we look at moving Africa forward, those of us in the diaspora, I think we play a key part in that, just by knowing that we are African also, and we have to get past some of those micro issues that stop us from seeing ourselves as African. So that's what I'll start with there in terms of agency. I think it's psychological to start.
All right, because you took the words, I believe, right out of both of our mouths, because the follow-up question that I was about to ask is, are we African?
That's a hell of a question, my brother.
Are we?
Judging by the way we timed this program, looks like we carried something over, right? We learned. So,
Absolutely. No, of course, that's my position. Of course, we have our various nuances in terms of identity. We in the diaspora, at least I'm speaking for myself, born in the United States, born in the Deep South in Mississippi. Many do not see themselves as Africans here. So it's an educational process for sure. We have trailblazers who have taught us well that we are global people. So from that framework, I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of our people seeing one identity with its various nuances.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, absolutely we are African, but I think we can also hold space for multiple identities. For some reason, there's this false dichotomy set up that if I say I'm an African, I'm no longer a New Orleanian, or I'm no longer a Louisianian, or I'm no longer an American. We hold space for multiple identities, just as someone who is from Kenya or South Africa can identify as a Kenyan or a South African without any threat to their Africanness. We too can identify as African. And I'd be very clear, because sometimes in the diaspora there's this idea that we somehow have to seek approval to claim as an African. My idea was this, is that we were Africans when the Europeans put us on those boats. We were Africans when we disembarked. We were Africans when we began to create our culture and on those plantations. So everything that we created was created by Africans, an authentic African culture created by Africans in the West, as identified by Carter G. Woodson. So the idea that we are not is problematic in many ways, but it's also the result of years, centuries of brainwashing and internalized white supremacy that sought to disconnect us from the continent. So anytime a Black American says that they're African, it's actually a revolutionary act.
Yeah, and I would add on the point that when we talk about African agency, we have to understand the historical context of the Ma'afa, right? So the Kiswahili word, which was coined by Dr. Marimba Ani, who was, her government name originally was Dora Richards, who was part of SNCC, which was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee back during the Civil Rights era, in which she was a cultural anthropologist and sociologist in discussing and understanding what the African Holocaust was and is, also referred to as the Ma'afa, which means the Great Catastrophe. So oftentimes you hear for Jewish folks, it's referred to as the Shoah. For Palestinians, the Nakba. Well, for us, it's the Ma'afa. And it's understanding through oral tradition and understand the historical context of where we came from. And that over time, that there was not also a Ma'afa that happened through the diaspora, there was also a Ma'afa that was happening on the African continent. So, because I remember I talked to a student that I mentored who was actually from Kenya, and I had a discussion saying that, it must be lovely, knowing your history and knowing where you came from. And she says, you have to understand that we also, through colonialism, were dispersed. And there are certain aspects of our culture that we have lost as well. So it's not just from the diaspora, but it was also what happened internally. And I think that we actually have much more in common than different. If it was not the case, we wouldn't be here, right? So let's follow up with the second question of how can the African diaspora influence U.S. politics, shape policy decisions, or serve as a key point of engagement with stakeholders to support African initiatives?
Dr. Chapman, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll start with that one. I'm conducting research, a comparative study on student activism in the United States and South Africa. And in terms of influencing policy, just through my research, and I cover a 50-year time period from 66 to 2016, students were on the front lines of organizing and protesting and making things happen from even pre-60, even pre-civil rights, pre-Black Power, but my era is that 50-year time period. But my point is that students have demonstrated throughout history that they change the scope and process of the struggle in terms of their activism. And we've seen this in the civil rights movement, moving on through Black Power, the Black Arts movement, all the way up through Bees Must Fall in South Africa, Black Lives Matter. So in terms of agency and policy, I think it's in the hands of the youth, in the hands of the students. They're the ones who really get out and on the campuses and take it to the streets to demand change. We saw recently in the U.S. with students on their campuses making their voices heard for Palestine. So it's very important that the youth are involved initially, which history has demonstrated. They take it to the streets.
I like that. I think we first need to talk about the two diasporas.
Yes.
Right? So we have, as we define the old diaspora, those of us who are descendants of slavery, and then the new diaspora of, and we're speaking specifically of in the American context, because there's Haiti is the African diaspora, Jamaica, all of Brazil, Colombia, but as Americans here, there's the new diaspora that started coming to the U.S. really mid 60s and thereafter. And strategically, I think it's very important for that new diaspora to be fully integrated into the old diaspora. And here's a reason why. In the 80s, when the AIDS epidemic was ravaging Africa, it was the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, who was advocating on behalf of the continent. Now, that kind of African consciousness has kind of gone away because the 90s came and there were some tough times for African Americans. As you say, it's kind of difficult to focus on the continent when we're trying to focus on eating or surviving some of the viciousness that we face. So, but the integration of the new diaspora, or the contemporary dispersal, as I like to call it, will into our infrastructure will then again help to put that back, put Africa back on the agenda for Black Americans. So I think that's one step we have to take. And on our end, it is making sure that we are embracing, the Nigerians, the Ghanaians, and Somalis who are coming to the U.S. And to try to navigate some very serious differences. I mean, we have been in the West for 400 years, and there are some things that there's just in the U.S. There's things that are just different, and different perceptions and different ways we see the world. But again, I believe personally, once you're in the U.S., you have a common enemy, and that common enemy forces us to be all on the same team.
Yeah, and I would add on that we actually have to talk about the concept of global white supremacy, and also understanding that Pan-Africanism and the African diaspora of the old and the new is not new. So we can go back to the Haitian Revolution, where Haitians, some came to Cuba, some went to Mexico, some went to Louisiana, New Orleans, and created more diverse African Americans, because there's not just one African American, where there's diversity even within African American culture. And also with the concept of Pan-Africanism with Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, the Black Star Line, the Go Back to Africa movement. So there has always been a multicultural aspect to Pan-Africanism, and understanding that there's not one way of looking at Pan-Africanism, because there were debates, right? Absolutely. There continues to be debates, because we're multifaceted. Because white supremacy would say we're just one thing.
One homogenous group.
Exactly. So let's continue on within the concept of the 21st century of African agency, especially with the upcoming November elections in the US. So what's your thoughts of African agency after November 5th? What does that look like? Of course, we don't know, because we're not sure who's going to be in office. But what does that look like?
Again, it shows that we're on the same team, right? Like, if you're looking at what candidate will be good for the African continent, there's only one answer. What candidate will be good for African American people? There's really only one answer. And I'm not saying they're the best or will be. One is far worse than the other. Okay. What was?
Krista Johnson. Hi, Dr. Krista Johnson. Yes, so could you please join in the conversation?
Do you want me to speak now? I'm happy to chime in whenever.
Yes, please. Yes.
Hey, Dr. Johnson.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Sorry to be joining late. I'm sorry. This is my teaching day, so a lot going on here, and different. This is the problem with the time zones. But I appreciate this conversation. Really, interesting and important. And I think something that will continue to be discussed. I mean, I was just going to add. Of course, I'm in Washington D.C. and I'm at Howard University, so sitting here, and of course, with all the election buzz going on now, and I just initiative, Commission on African Diaspora Engagement, which at the moment has been, doing a lot of kind of discussion groups and talking to a lot of groups and doing several visits over to the continent and making those links. It's been a bit of a kind of maybe a feel-good session at the moment. We haven't really seen tangible policy positions that they're proposing to push with Congress or with this administration or even with a new administration, unfortunately. But I think that's hopefully the next steps. It is a relatively new commission, so we're hoping to see if that is going to be an avenue or a venue through which the African diaspora can directly impact and engage U.S. Africa policy. I also just wanted to kind of, I think, highlight, I think, some of the things, because Assad's, very right, that, as I said, the diaspora is just becoming so much more diverse. There's a proliferation of organizations and groups here. Some of them, based on nationality. So you have Nigerian American associations, Ghanaian American associations, and all these other, groupings proliferated throughout the United States. So the real kind of question becomes, how do we come together and at least find commonality around a certain core, set of issues that we want to prioritize. And I would say also, I had written a piece about a month ago, which was, also just talking about how we need to be cognizant about how certain U.S. imperatives and interests, as well as African imperatives and interests, can have the effect of either courting or prioritizing certain constituencies within the African diaspora. And we need to kind of be cognizant about making sure that we work against forces that may serve to sow division and sow conflict among the African diaspora community. Not that we're going to, and I think, one of the points that I was trying to highlight is that we are a diverse group. And to Assad's point, the historic diaspora both have deep connections with the continent, but our issues oftentimes can be seen, tend to manifest themselves in different ways. So the historic diaspora has always been very, very concerned with issues of racial and social justice, with self-determination, liberation. You saw this in terms of the mobilization around the anti-apartheid movement, right? You saw this in terms of the End SARS movement, or the Fees Must Fall or Roads Must Fall movement in South Africa. There are a number of issues where the African American community, or this historic diaspora, sees connections and ties with the continent. And those have been very successful. Black Lives Matter, those have been very successful campaigns and initiatives that we can see intra-diaspora alliances really connecting. The new diaspora, of course, speaks much more with its power through its remittances and other things, sees much more kind of connections to Africa's more immediate and most contemporary, imperatives of African development and just, kind of trade and investment and really getting resources and money into Africa so that it can develop in the way that it needs to. So there's kind of multiple roles, I think, that many different groups can play, and they don't have to be seen as adversarial or contradictory. And I think we need to kind of find ways of managing that more, because I think you are going to see, again, many groups, and I think, again, to Assad's point, the historic diaspora has a lot of experience through, the Congressional Black Caucus, through any number of other avenues of understanding how to effect change and how to influence U.S. policy, right? And the new diaspora would do well to learn those lessons and to maybe listen a little bit and understand, okay, how is it actually that we can be most effective in terms of pushing our agenda in the United States, both in Congress, but even at a subnational level. I don't know if we've talked about that in this conference yet either, but just really the power and the importance of subnational groups on the continent and here in the United States. Sister city partnerships and all the rest of that, of course, become really important avenues through which the diaspora can exercise agency and influence significant policy, significant exchanges and engagements, with the continent. I'll stop there, but I'm happy to chime in some more.
Well,
Thank you.
I'm going to play moderator right now. I want to bring up the issue of these diaspora wars that are taking place. And I'll frame it this way. It is, in many ways, it is not as disheartening as it may seem, because at least we're talking. For centuries, we haven't spoken. And now the internet has given us the opportunity to, and when I mean we haven't spoken, here's what I'm saying. Gil Scott-Heron, anybody familiar with Gil Scott? Oh, I guess not. Okay. So, right, okay, so Gil Scott-Heron was a poet and a singer, and he was a revolutionary, right?
Will not be televised.
And he was on Saturday Night Live. I'm sure you guys have heard of Saturday Night Live. Saturday Night Live is hosted by Richard Pryor, who at the time was the biggest comedian in the world. African-American Richard Pryor. All black eyes in America are about to be watching Richard Pryor on Saturday Night Live. The musical guest is Gil Scott-Heron. The song he sings is What's the Word? Johannesburg. This is during apartheid, right? He is a song that's literally saying we are reaching out to our brothers in Johannesburg. Please tell us what's going on, because the news won't tell us. We are here for you. We want to fight alongside of you. I moved to South Africa 2 years ago, and I asked people had they ever heard the song. You never even heard of it. Right? So we had not been communicating. So now the diaspora wars are at least us starting to have these conversations, tough conversations that need to take place, right? But at least we're talking. And furthermore, these diaspora wars are not taking place with Chinese or Pakistanis. It's only between these black people. So obviously there's a recognition that we are related, that we are family, and that we need to have this family feud or whatever have you, and then get over it and move on.
Yeah, and I would add to the point that, so I teach in New York, and I mean, when we talk about diaspora wars, then that can get really messy, because I would say like half of my students would say that, well, my mom is Jamaican and my father is Nigerian, or my mom is Black American and my grandfather was from Haiti. I mean, I'm African American, I identify as that, but I have ancestries from Haiti. So it gets very, again, it goes back to the point of when we talk about the concept of what is African American is very diverse. And it has always been that way, because that's what the diaspora is that there's always been movement, whether it was involuntary or as the Ma'afa, as I discussed earlier, or by choice for better opportunities. But when we talk about better opportunities, is that really a choice from that perspective of leaving someone's home for out of, if it was due to war or due to other experiences. So I wanted to point that out, that when we talk about diaspora wars, it might be, this concept of Africans versus African Americans, or,
It's so funny that we even...
It's more complex than that, because so many of us have multiple cultural backgrounds of blackness, if that makes sense.
Right. And I have Haitian heritage also. And growing up, seeing images of Haiti or Jamaica, I just knew Jamaica was an African country. Like when I was like 6 years old, I thought, I said, gotta be on the continent, right? So anyway, I'll just leave it.
Yeah, so at this point, we will wrap it up, and
thank you guys.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Our colleagues Asad El Malik and Blair Proctor. Blair, as you mentioned, is a Fulbright scholar at our center, African Center for the Study of the U.S. at WITS. And Asad is in charge of the Diaspora Project. I want to mention for colleagues here who are interested in matters diaspora that these two gentlemen and the lady who is online there, Professor Krista Johnson from Howard University, are foremost scholars on matters African diaspora. And so you do not need to read volumes and volumes of books or to read a lot of strategy documents and so forth. A Zoom chat with them will help you quite a bit. so that you reduce the amount of hours you sit at your desk reading. And so all you need to do is reach out, and they're very keen to engage, which is a good thing. But at this point in time, I'd like to invite Ms. Winrogut and I think you can just come along with Shem, who is on your panel. And we have one more colleague. This panel is entitled African Agency in Global Dynamics, Peace, Development, and Non-Alignment. We did hear out one of our speakers speak on non-alignment, Nicodemus Minde, in the morning. So we have just, okay, let me turn it over to Winnie. She knows what to say and do. A round of applause for her.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wekesa. My name is Winnie Rugut. As he's rightfully explained, I'm a member of faculty at the Department of Diplomacy and International Studies at the University of Nairobi. For those who know the University of Nairobi, we like saying it's the mother university, right? I'm from a very lovely community of scholars and practitioners who are interested in matters of US-Africa partnership. So just like Dr. Wekesa, we have a very new Africa Center for the Study of the US and at the University of Nairobi, and we are being, can we say we are being guided by the WITS team to grow, and that's how I'm here. Okay, so this panel, I know our sugar levels are, yes, we're just from lunch, but now they're going there. They're going lower. I want to keep it direct to the point. We want to talk about non-alignment, the question of non-alignment, and the theme is Africa's Agency in Global Dynamics, Peace, Development, and Non-Alignment. So the whole, from the morning, we've been talking about the question of Africa's agency and how African countries can leverage on their position to be more meaningful actors in the international system. And non-alignment offers a unique strategy in the evolving landscape. And as I was talking to my colleague here, somebody asked, is non-alignment, does it really work out? Does it happen? Are there countries that are really non-aligned in the 21st century? And so this panel discussion wants to hone into that conversation. And just as an introduction, we will have three panelists. The first panelist is with me here, Mr. Siteki. Mr. Siteki is a scholar from United States International University, and he'll be talking about a paper he's written on state agency, actorness, and global powers. It already sounds very interesting. And he'll be anchoring this conversation on the question of non-alignment. Mr. Siteki is also a scholar who writes on regionalism, international security, cooperation and stateness, intermestic politics, and the East African region. But most importantly, he's a scholar on foreign policy and Kenya's foreign policy. Nice to see you, Mr. Siteki. And then we have online, just to check if they're here, Dr. Bian from Eritrea. Dr. Bian is a lecturer, College of Business and Social Sciences, and he'll be talking about the question of non-alignment from an Eritrean perspective, where he'll be talking to us about a paper and a research is done on the European Union and Eritrea's development cooperation. Dr. Bian, are you with us today? Yes, this is a tech life. Okay, so hopefully, I don't know, maybe we could just check if he's around, because he was actually on call earlier on. As I go to Mr. Beyene from Ethiopia, so brothers and sisters here from the Horn, Mr. Beyene is a researcher and PhD candidate at Addis Ababa University, Ethiopia. And on this theme of Africa's agency, he'll be joining us to discuss the role of civil society organizations addressing conflict drivers and promoting peace building. Mr. Beyene, are you with us today?
Definitely.
Yeah. Oh, amazing, amazing. Thank you. We can hear you. I hope we will be able to see you. But for now, let's go straight into the conversation. And because you're online, let's start with you. Between five or so minutes, and maybe you could be kind and just keep our time, tell us more about your paper and anchor it on this question of non-alignment and how Africa can actually use this as a strategy. Is it viable in your opinion? and what from your research can be done to attain any form of non-alignment. Thank you, Mr. Beyene.
Okay, thank you so much. You, you, thank you so much. For giving me this opportunity to present, my research finding on the roles of civil society organizations in bridging borders through peace building. Insights from Institute of Insights from Ethiopian Institute of Peace. So, allow me to focus on like to focus on the role of this important civil society organization in in bridging borders, like especially between Ethiopia and Kenya. My major emphasis here is that on the conflict between Nyangatom, uh, Dasanich, and Turkana, instead of reflecting my point of view on the non-alignment one. Is that okay?
Yes, of course, of course.
Okay, thank you so much. So, here, I would like to give a bit uh, background of this Ethiopian Institute of Peace civil society organization. This organization, the reason that I choose this organization is that, the year 2005 in Ethiopian context has been it was a turning point where civil society organizations uh, played an important role, especially in creating a very conducive environment for national election of Ethiopia. So, following that, the government wasn't happy and came up with
you.
Additionally,
So
yes,
thank you, Bayane. Your insights are very interesting because you are picking on a question on the idea or the fact that non-state actors in Africa, particularly what I'm getting from you is from Kenya and Ethiopia, these borderland communities are able to hone in on these non-state actors, as you're explaining, the Ethiopia Institute for Peace and working with women and various actors in this region, are able to find their way of finding ingenious way like cultural initiatives for peace building. But just, I want, because your research sounds very interesting to the broader question of Africa's agency. And you bring out a very interesting point of non-state actors. These actors who ordinarily we yes, are important, but are not well amplified in the conversation on the Africa's agency. We look at it from a more broader perspective. And so maybe to conclude for 1 minute, in your own opinion, how can non-state actors play a part in enabling African countries to better strengthen their agency in their engagement with other global actors? As you conclude.
okay. Thank you so much for your insightful question. So, this my study entails that these non-state actors, they are presumed by both the global actors in the domestic actors, especially who are in conflict. They presumed them as a neutral entities or a neutral actors. They didn't take side like from the parties who are already in conflict. So I think this gives them a leverage like to oiling the wheel and like to bring communities together. I think there was like a very good attempt like this attempted by this Ethiopian Institute of Peace that, for instance, talking about peace and like getting back to home, it will be nonsense like without like substantiating it or integrating it without livelihood activities. So they are trusted. So finally, they came up with like subsidizing these peace building activities with livelihood. For instance, they provided like important equipment that are important to the communities to engage on fishing, the communities to share like resources. So the most important thing is that these non-state actors or civil society organizations presumed as neutral entities. So they trust to negotiate parties who are in conflict. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bayane. And I know, Bayane, we know we will get back to you as the conversation continues, but let's hear from Mr. Siteki here, who is with us right now. And then next will be Dr. Bayane. I don't know if Dr. Bian, sorry, is here with us. He's not here with us. Okay, so we are just going to stick to Mr. Siteki. It's just me and you. It's a dialogue from here on. So quickly, tell us about your paper. It sounds very interesting, but please, let's hear that non-alignment aspect.
Thank you so much. I don't know if you can hear me. Thank you for the opportunity. I'll just go straight in. My paper focused on, because since morning, of course, this conference is talking about African agency. But for my paper, I tended to concentrate on state agency, right? So as a country, as Kenya, what role has it played in trying to push its agenda on the world map or regionally or globally in terms of peace and security? And just for background, so the paper is framed on Kenya's agency in relation to peace and security in the broader framework of African agency in regards to peace and security. So as a background, so from since independence, and of course I've based my paper on the historical accounts. And my good professor, Professor Munene, mentioned that there have been instances where Kenya has played a big part in terms of peace and security. And so for me, my paper was geared towards locating Kenya's agenda in terms of peace and security. So as a background, so from since independence, though it hasn't been viewed that way, Africa has always been a passive player when it comes to peace and security. And it has always been looked at from the global powers. And in terms of theory, it has always been looked at in terms of either realism or neoliberalism. But we have aspects of, before I get to the non-aligned movement, we have aspects of the AU playing a major role in terms of advancing peace and security both regionally and globally. And of course, there has been challenges. Of course, we have mentioned about them in previous speakers when they were talking about the challenges that Africa has when it comes to addressing the challenges of peace and security, and part of it has to do with capacity. But when, of course, the AU has been able to advance peace and security development within the continent, and it has been able to go around its challenges by collaborating with, say, partners who have been mentioned before, say now the AU, and of course, regional players. So we can mention that, yes, or rather my paper identifies that, yes, Africa has been able to advance its agenda when it comes to peace and security through the AU. And at the same time, regional organizations have played a part. Despite the challenges that they face, they've always been able to play a role in trying to raise their voice in terms of peace and security. Though it hasn't been explicit, but there have been aspects of it. And then, of course, regionally, when it comes to, say, West Africa, we have regional organizations such as the ECOWAS, and we have regional powers like Nigeria, who have been advancing their role in terms of peace and security within West Africa. And at the same time, when it gets to yeah, this is better. Yeah, so in South Africa, of course, we've seen it advancing its role as a major player when it comes to peace and security in the southern region. And so, yes, there has been aspects of Africa playing a role within the peace and security architecture. And so my goal, of course, as I've mentioned, my goal of my paper was to identify how Kenya has applied its agency. And it sought to ask, rather than asking how the external actors have determined Kenya's peace and security, it sought to understand and ask how far and by what means Kenya has, as a regional state actor, been impacting on and conducting itself in the peace and security agenda. And so the questions for the paper went further to ask or try to unravel the key sources or areas of agency where Kenya has played. And now coming on to the non-aligned movement, the paper identified, of course, in the morning we talked about, in the morning session we talked about traditional non-aligned movement. And here we find that traditionally in the non-aligned movement, Kenya was a big player, just as other African countries. Of course, now we have 100 African countries who are in the non-aligned movement, except for South Sudan. And going by history, even just before independence and just right after, Kenya was very pivotal, just as other African countries have been in trying to make or advance agency when it comes to peace and security. Of course, at that time, being a young nation, there was opposition, when the government had its policy of trying to be non-aligned, the opposition tried to move it towards the east. But the Kenyan government stood firm, and they say that they wouldn't be focusing on either side, but they will rather, if anything, if they were to partner in terms of security cooperation, it will be on their interests. And even when it came to purchasing of weapons, it was found that at some point it did seem to gravitate towards the West, but at the same time it stood firm and mentioned that their goal in terms of purchasing weapons from the West was in trying to meet its interests. So, and at the same time, when it came to another point in time where Kenya has advanced agency in peace and security, is in peacekeeping. And here the paper identifies the peacekeeping operations that the country has been able to conduct since from independence up to this point in time. And of course, you are aware that Kenya has sent its security forces in Haiti to try and quell the conflict there. And so its advancement of peacekeeping has mostly been advanced within Africa, but at the same time elsewhere as well. And then, of course, it's regional mediation. It has been talked about that it has always been at the forefront of trying to ensure that there is peace in Sudan. And of course, the peace agreement that Kenya advocated for in, or rather midwifed in 2005. So we find that there has been some aspects of Kenya playing a role in terms of advancing agency, and of course, the non-aligned movement from the paper stood out as an area where Kenya has played a part or raised its voice in peace and security. Yeah, so essentially that's what my paper was all about.
Okay.
Back to you.
Let's see. You can hear me? Yeah?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, so thank you so much, Mr. Siteki. You know, the question of non-alignment in the present day, because I like the idea that you presented, the traditional understanding of non-alignment, the non-alignment movement. And the non-alignment movement, as we remember in the 1950s, emerged from a geopolitical, tussle of two powers. You had NATO, the NATO alliance on one side, and Warsaw Pact on the other side. And I think when we were putting together this idea of non-alignment, what was in our mind is that we are in another type of multipolar geopolitical tussle. Now it's no longer just two actors, we have multiple actors. And what came to my mind when I thought about this topic of non-alignment is that there are countries like Kenya who, quote unquote, say that they are non-aligned. Most recently, President William Ruto, when he was in the US and was asked, so is now Kenya leaning west or are we leaning east? And I remember he said, we are looking forward. I don't, remember that conversation? Yeah. Meaning that we are not trying to pick a side. And for me, what I'm thinking about non-alignment is, as a strategy, is it really viable? Can countries, Africa countries, really walk that tightrope in the 21st century as they pursue, based on your research, issues of peace and security? Yeah.
Yeah, as mentioned earlier from previous speakers, I think where we are at the moment, we are at a very pivotal time globally, right? There are so many issues that are happening. And Africa is being looked at as the next frontier. Yeah. And of course, we've talked about this for quite some time in discussions about the role that Africa can play. And one of the speakers talked about, Africa being that we have one of the largest youth population, globally. And of course, there's all that advancement within the Africa Union Agenda 2063. There's that whole aspect of pushing the AFTA
Yes,
agreement.
yeah.
And just like the EU, Africa seeks to, trade amongst itself, being that we have this burgeoning youth population.
Yeah.
And so I feel like Africa has a part to play, and of course with the conflicts that are happening, and as I was looking into my paper, one of the solutions that Africa can bring, in the space of the conflicts that we have, going back to the traditional non-aligned movement. We had these middle powers, and middle powers has been advanced by Randall Schweller, that scholar, and he mentioned, or he talks about, he asserts that middle powers during the non-aligned movement, the traditional non-aligned movement, they were able to act as a buffer between the two warring parties. The East and the West. And so, for me, I feel like Africa at this moment in time can try and mirror the middle powers, right? And practice middle diplomacy, the way middle powers act. Of course, we are not middle powers, but we have a number of countries, 7 countries in Africa, that can be said to be middle powers. And for me, I can say, I can extend that and say that we should practice equidistance diplomacy, which is sort of like an in-between diplomacy when it gets to trying to, say, solve in the agenda of solving the conflicts that are happening globally, and even the Ukraine. At least we tried, but we should be raising our voice and trying to mirror equidistance diplomacy and trying to probably mediate, the warring parties within, both regionally and globally. Yeah, so I think that would go a long way in trying to raise our profile and our voice. Yes. Yeah.
So, because this can be a dialogue for 5 hours, we want to open it to the audience. The question of non-aligned movement, and not just the movement, but the concept itself of non-alignment in this century or in this season. Is it viable? Is it even realistic? Can we do it? I see a hand at the corner, so we start with you, and then we just give you a minute. It's not necessarily a question, it could be a comment, and then any other? Sawa. Let's start there as we conclude.
Thank you very much. Excellent paper. I like the idea of equidistant diplomacy. I think African governments are listening to you. I'll tell you why. President Ruto, when he came to Washington and gave that answer, what he didn't tell the journalist is that he had a senior delegation of his ruling party that was in Beijing, which actually landed in Beijing the very same day that the Kenya government delegation landed in Washington, D.C. It was a huge delegation, and it had very, very high-level meetings with different parts of the Communist Party of China, and quite a number of commitments came out of that engagement. So again, equidistant diplomacy. One part of the government is in Washington, the other part is in Beijing. So I guess some governments are listening to you. Similarly, Tanzania. Tanzania and China held a major military exercise on the eve of the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation. This was the largest deployment, this was the largest Chinese military deployment in Africa since 2000. And we saw the People's Liberation Army bringing Chinese contingents, this time not from the naval base in Djibouti, but from mainland China, by air and by sea. That was a major demonstration of the PLA's growing expeditionary capabilities. Now this sounds a little frightening, right? But a few months before that, the Tanzanians and the United States engaged in a major military exercise, Justified Accord, which is the US Africa Command's second largest annual military exercise with African forces. So again, is the Tanzanian Defense Force going east or is it going west? it seems to me that the Chief of General Staff of the TPDF is listening to you, because clearly the Tanzanian military is practicing equidistant diplomacy. So I just wanted to make that comment. It looks like people are listening to your advice.
Already this advice is working. So thank you. Any other comment on the question of non-alignment? There's a lovely lady at the back.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for closing off the day. So a few months ago, I was at the US.
Do you mind introducing yourself?
Okay.
Sorry.
Hi, my name is Valerie Butelezi. I work at the African Center for the Study of the US at WITS. So a few months ago, I was at the US Embassy in Pretoria, and we spoke to the ambassador, and he said, in his response, when we were speaking to him, he said, the US only engages with people and parties if they are beneficial to the US, and they only engage with them if they are presenting themselves in a way that only benefits them. So I believe that, or not necessarily only benefits them, but prioritizes the goals or ideals of the US, such as democracy or whatever they claim to be their multiple goals and perspectives. So I believe that if these global powers that are seemingly dominant parties in global geopolitics are positioning themselves first, it would be remiss for Africans to actually use any narrative or perspective that is not non-alignment, because clearly you can't say I will align with the West because the West is putting itself first. You can't align with the East. The East is putting itself first. If you're aligning with one side, you're always going to be lost.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment. Any other? Yes, sir, at the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter Mbuva once again. I think it was this year in January when Dr. Bob Wekesa led such a serious symposium in Uganda during the accession of the Uganda chairmanship to the NAM, if my history is right. And some of the issues that Museveni addressed upon assuming that office is how to deal with the current issues of, actually he emphasized on manufacturing as a key area to be able to put some of the African countries to a level where they can compete with the rest. Having said that, I've read another material where South African scholars make a clarion call to the African leaders to end issues of conflict and debt, because they find they are the key areas of attraction of intervention by external powers. Probably you could allude to issues of national and external sovereignty, because it's a wounding area. We saw the other day in Gambia, they were against ECOWAS coming in to bring solutions. So how are we going to handle our own issues, even belonging to the NAM, and we don't want to appear to intervene? And when we know that whenever peace and security is threatened, it interferes with the very element of development and the well-being of the citizens is interfered with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that will be enough for today. Do you want to comment on just the general ideas that have come up as we conclude?
Yeah, the ideas are good and they are welcome. And I think for me, just by discussing African agency already is a step towards raising our voices. Because we can't raise our voices without, you being there and I being here. We have to come together and discuss. And for me, I feel, of course, with this whole idea of non-alignment, I feel there should be a reconstruction of the non-aligned movement. And at some point, it was suggested that it should be called some other name. Can't quite remember the name. But I think we should move away, right? Just as one of our respondents has mentioned, we should move away from the whole idea of, aligning with this or aligning with that. We should be talking about another whole new organization. And it's funny enough to think about the non-aligned movement being nestled in New York, right? Are we really talking about, being independent and being, equidistant if we have the non-aligned movement, say, offices held at New York, right? So I feel when we are engaging or when you're talking about new non-aligned movement, we should be thinking of conceptualizing a new organization or a new entity, that serves the purpose that, it will draw us into the future. Yeah, because, we've talked about the traditional and now we're talking about non-alignment too, but now we should move away with the non-alignment and talk about a new entity. And I feel also when we're engaging with these global powers, yes, we should engage with them because we are in a multilateral environment, or rather we are moving into that whole space. And we should be looking at, just as one of our respondents mentioned about, if you align with the East, if you align with the West, the East is focusing on its own national interest.
Yeah.
And so for us, we should be very clear in our minds and in our engagements that we should be talking about our own interests, right? And if we are to, engage with these global powers, it should be us leading the charge. And then if they have to come in, they have to support us. So they should back us, but we should lead at the front. Yeah.
Well, I think that's such a nice way to conclude the idea that if we are to talk about non-alignment right now, it should, in the context of Africa's agency, then African will be taking lead. And so engaging with the different countries, when they're looking east or west, it should be first them and then others. So as we conclude, what I'm hearing from the crowd is this I've learned a new equidistance diplomacy, right? Equidistance diplomacy. Countries. Thank you so much for listening and giving us your time. We conclude there for this last panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Winnie. I think you did a good job in keeping it short, and I wouldn't want to, make it any more painful for you to keep sitting here and listening. I'm sure what you need is relief, therapy of some kind, in the form of a very nice dinner, followed with the possibility of a drink. Of course, this is Kenya, so wine is not very famous for South Africans here, but you can enjoy a beer. And to help us, I could have said plenty to wrap up, but I would like to just hand over to Dr. Kidiva to direct us to the place of therapy at this point in time. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Daktari. We are so glad that all has gone well except for a small hitch, but that will not be repeated. The dinner will be where we had the lunch, Masai Mara, and for tomorrow, we will move to the Strathmore Business School auditorium. Everything is being moved to the business school. And that's why I have the confidence to reiterate that everything will be fine in terms of the technological hookups. So the dinner will be in Masai Mara, and it is now. So that where we had lunch, yeah. So the therapy is immediate.